Somewhere in eastern France, in the winter of 1944, a white American officer refused to salute a black lieutenant. For 80 years, one story about what General George S. Patton did next has traveled through American memory. Most of that story is wrong. What actually happened is harder. It is more painful. And it is the true one. This is that story. Camp Hood, Texas. The evening of July 6, 1944. An army bus is pulling out of the base. Inside, a black officer takes a seat near the middle. He is 25 years old, First Lieutenant, United States Army. His name is Jack Roosevelt Robinson. The driver looks in the mirror. He tells the lieutenant to move to the back. Robinson does not move. Military police arrive within minutes. There is shouting. There are threats of court-martial. The lieutenant is taken into custody on his own base, wearing his own uniform in the country he has sworn to defend. 3 years from this night, Jackie Robinson will step onto a baseball field in Brooklyn and break a color line that America thought was permanent. But tonight he is just a black officer who would not move to the back of the bus. And tonight is the beginning of a story that has almost nothing to do with him. Because Jackie Robinson was assigned to a tank battalion. That battalion was about to sail for France. And the commander waiting for them on the other side of the Atlantic was a 4-star general with a Confederate grandfather and a reputation for blood and thunder speeches. His name was George S. Patton, Jr. This is the story of what he actually did when the army he served refused to salute the men he was sending to die. To understand what happened between Patton and the 761st Tank Battalion, you have to understand the paper that came before them. In 1925, the United States Army War College produced a study. It was internal. It was not meant for public consumption. It concluded in clinical language that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the initiative required for modern armored warfare. The study was 20 years old by the winter of 1944. It was still shaping policy when the 761st Tank Battalion was activated on April 1st, 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The men who reported for training did so under the shadow of that document. They did not need to read it. They lived inside its conclusions every day. They trained for 2 years. 2 years. While white armored units cycled through Camp Hood and shipped out to North Africa to Sicily to the beaches of Normandy, the 761st waited. The army found reasons, reassignments, reviews, questions about whether black men could operate a 34-ton Sherman tank in combat conditions. The men trained anyway. They learned gunnery. They learned maneuver. They learned to fight a war the army was not sure it wanted them to fight. Their commander was a white officer named Paul L. Bates, Lieutenant Colonel, 35 years old, career soldier. Bates could have played it safe. Most white officers assigned to black units did. They filed the paperwork. They collected the rank. They waited for reassignment. Bates chose differently. When Jackie Robinson was arrested that July night in 1944, the court-martial charges came to Bates's desk. Bates read them. He refused to sign. The post commander at Camp Hood found another officer who would. Robinson was transferred to the 758th Tank Battalion where the paperwork moved forward. He was later acquitted. But by then the 761st had shipped out without him. Robinson would never see combat. That was the first thing that happened to the men of the 761st. Before they ever saw a German. Before they ever heard artillery. Their most famous soldier was gone. Not to a bullet. To a bus seat. The other stayed. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was 26 years old. He was born October 31st, 1918 in Tecumseh, Oklahoma. One of 12 children. His family had worked farms. He had worked the railroad. He was quiet according to the men who served with him. He was steady. He led a tank platoon in Company A. His company commander was a young white captain named David J. Williams. Warren J. Chickrisi was a gunner from Texas. His crew called him the baddest man in the army. It was not a compliment about his manners. William McBurney was a tank commander from Harlem, New York. These are the men. There were others. 6 white officers, 30 black officers, 676 black enlisted men. That was the 761st Tank Battalion. That was who arrived at Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944, 4 months after D-Day. The tide of the war had turned. The beach was quiet. Landing craft that had once carried men into machine gun fire now carried them into a war that was already moving east. They came ashore into that war. Their commander in Europe was waiting. George S. Patton Jr. was 58 years old that autumn. He would turn 59 on November 11th. He was the grandson of a Confederate colonel who had been mortally wounded at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864. That grandfather's name was also George Smith Patton. His photograph hung in the general's home. It hung in his mind. Patton's biographer, Carlo d'Este, would later write that Patton on one hand admired the toughness and courage of black soldiers he had commanded. On the other hand, d'Este wrote Patton's own words could be read as disdaining them and their officers because they were not part of his social order. He was not a progressive. He was not a reformer. He was a soldier who believed the army was a machine, and machines work according to their design. The design of the 1944 United States Army said all soldiers were equal under the Uniform Code. The reality of the 1944 United States Army said something else. Every black officer in Europe knew the difference. They lived in the space between the paper and the practice. There is a story that Patton personally requested the 761st Tank Battalion for his Third Army. The story is half true. What Patton asked the War Department for was more tanks. The best tanks available. What the War Department told him was that the only armored battalion still uncommitted to combat was the 761st. Colored, segregated, untested. According to accounts preserved by Warfare History Network and repeated in later oral histories. Patton's response was not the response of a man moved by principle. It was the response of a man moved by irritation. Who the hell asked for color, he is said to have said. I asked for tankers. That line is not in any official document. It survives as an oral tradition. It is offered here because multiple veterans repeated it after the war. It is flagged here because Patton himself never confirmed it in writing. But if he said it, and the men of the 761st believed he said it, then the meaning is clear. He did not choose them out of conviction. He chose them because they were the only tank battalion he could get. On October 28, 1944, near the town of Nancy, France, Patton assembled the 761st. He climbed onto the hood of an armored car. The men were formed up in front of him. Tank crews, officers, sergeants, men who had trained for 2 years and crossed an ocean and now stood on French soil waiting to hear from him. He gave a speech. It has been preserved in the historical record. The exact date is questioned by some historians. The words are not. Men, he told them, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those crowd sons of bitches. He paused. Everyone has their eyes on you, he said. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down. And damn you don't let me down. He climbed back down. He got in his jeep. He drove away. 12 days later, the 761st would be in their first battle. 28 days later, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers would be dead. None of them knew that yet. They only knew that a 4-star general had told them in the crudest language available to him that their color did not matter. Some of them believed him. Some of them did not. All of them were about to find out. Because the truth of what Patton believed, and the truth of what the United States Army believed, and the truth of what the men of the 761st Tank Battalion were about to prove, in the mud and snow of eastern France were 3 different truths, and they were about to collide. November 8, 1944. Northeastern France. Rain had been falling for 3 days. The roads had dissolved into brown paste. American infantry crouched in the ditches beside a narrow track that led toward the village of Vic-sur-Selle. Ahead of them, blocking the road, was a felled tree. Beneath the tree were mines. Behind the tree in the tree line were German machine guns and mortars zeroed on the road. The men in the ditches could not move forward. They could not move back. Mortar rounds began walking down the line, and every second the situation held more American infantry died in the mud. The lead tank on the road belonged to Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. He was inside the Sherman. He could see through his periscope what the infantry could not. He understood with the plain arithmetic of a man who had trained for 2 years for exactly this moment, that if the tank column waited for engineers to clear the roadblock, the infantry in the ditches would all be dead before the engineers arrived. He did the thing that was not in the manual. He opened the hatch. He climbed down from the tank. He walked out into the road under German fire with only his sidearm on his hip. He carried a steel cable in his hand. He attached one end of the cable to the fallen tree. He walked back to his tank. He climbed inside. He backed the Sherman up. The tree came with him. The mines came with it. The road was open. The infantry stood up out of the ditches. The Silver Star recommendation for that action would be the first the 761st Tank Battalion ever received. Rivers would not live to wear it. November was long for the Black Panthers. By the end of the month, they had lost 24 men killed in action, 81 wounded, 14 tanks destroyed, 20 more damaged. They had also captured towns the army had assumed would take longer. They had opened roads. They had pushed east through terrain the Germans had chosen for its capacity to slow armor. They were not slow. On November 16, 1944, they came to a town called Gebling. There was a railroad crossing on the way in. A single set of tracks cutting across a muddy road. The kind of feature a tanker looks at and does not think about twice. Rivers's tank was in the lead. His crew crossed the tracks. The mine detonated under the front of the Sherman. The blast lifted the tank. Metal folded. Shrapnel and torn steel filled the compartment. Rivers took the worst of it in his right leg. The wound opened his flesh from knee to thigh. It cut down to the bone. He was pulled from the tank. Captain David J. Williams. The company commander ran forward. He was a young white officer who had trained with these men for 2 years and fought with them for 9 days, and he knew what a wound like that meant. It meant home. It meant a hospital in England. It meant Reuben Rivers going back to Tecumseh, Oklahoma on a train with a silver star and a purple heart and a limp but alive. Williams took a morphine syringe from a medic. He knelt in the mud beside his sergeant. The needle was half an inch from Rivers's leg when Rivers spoke. "Captain," he said, "you are going to need me." Williams told him he was going back. He told him he had a $1 million wound. He told him he was giving him a direct order. Rivers looked at him. "This is one order," he said. "The only order I'll ever disobey." He pushed the needle away. He got up. The medics were allowed to clean the wound. They were allowed to dress it. They were not allowed to evacuate him. Rivers took command of another tank. For 3 days, he directed fire from that tank while an infection took hold in his leg. He did not sleep. He did not lie down. On the night of November 18th, a medic came to him and told him the wound had turned. Gangrene was setting in. If he did not leave the front, he would die. He said no. Morning of November 19th, 1944. Just outside Göbling. The fog was thick. The ground was frozen. Company A was moving forward toward the town of Burg-Altroff. Rivers's tank was in the lead. Again, the fog began to lift. Out of it on the road ahead came shapes. They were Mark IV Panzers. Behind them, German tank destroyers. The Mark IV mounted a 75mm gun that had been killing Sherman since North Africa. The tank destroyers behind them mounted worse. And there was more than one of each. German anti-tank positions on the far ridge lit up the grey sky. Barrages of high explosives stomped across the intersection. 2 Panther Shermans were hit within the first minute. Bob Hammond died in his tank. Roderick Ewing died in his. Captain Williams gave the order to withdraw. Company A was outgunned. Everyone knew it. Everyone accepted it. That is what the order is for. That is what discipline is for. Rivers refused the order. He was on the radio. His voice through the static told Williams he had spotted the German anti-tank position. He said he was going to fire on it. He said he was going to cover the withdrawal. He ordered his driver forward. His tank moved into the open. It began firing. 1 other Sherman moved with him. The 2 of them together put suppressive fire on the ridge, while the rest of Company A pulled back. The German gunners on the ridge found the range. The round hit Rivers' tank. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers of Tecumseh, Oklahoma, was 26 years old. He had been in combat for 12 days. That night, Captain Williams sat down and began writing the paperwork that would recommend Reuben Rivers for the Medal of Honor of the United States of America. He submitted it on November 20th. The recommendation moved into channels. It disappeared. There is a document released decades later by the Department of Defense that examined why. The document was produced by researchers at Shaw University in 1993 at the direction of Congress and the United States Army. The conclusion was not a matter of dispute inside the Pentagon by the time it was written. It was only a matter of finally saying it. The reason Reuben Rivers did not receive the Medal of Honor in 1944 was that he was black. That is what the document said. It would take 53 years for a president to correct it. The Black Panthers did not stop. 3 weeks after Rivers died, on the morning of December 16, 1944, 3 German armies smashed through the American line in the Ardennes forest. It was the Battle of the Bulge. By December 21st, the German 5th Panzer Army had completed the encirclement of Bastogne, Belgium, and the men of the 101st Airborne Division inside it. There was one road in. The Germans were closing it. The 101st was down to a few rounds per man, and no artillery ammunition and no way out. Eisenhower called a conference of his senior commanders at Verdun. He looked at Patton. He asked him when he could attack north to relieve Bastogne. Patton said December 22nd. There was silence in the room. Patton was talking about turning 3 divisions of the 3rd Army 90 degrees on their axis in winter and driving them 100 miles north across icy roads in the dark in 72 hours. The staff officers who had spent careers planning operations said later it should not have been possible in the time Patton was proposing. He did it in 72 hours. The 761st Tank Battalion was part of that column. They fought through Tillet, through Remagne, through the Ardennes forest in temperatures that dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Their Shermans threw treads on ice. They fixed them in the open air in wind that could kill an unprotected man in 20 minutes, and they went back on the line. Somewhere in those days, Patton did something that no historian has ever fully explained. He gave an order. The German counteroffensive had included a special operation. Otto Skorzeny, the SS Commando, who had rescued Mussolini, had trained a unit of English-speaking German soldiers to wear American uniforms and infiltrate American lines. They killed sentries. They turned signposts. They spread confusion. It was called Operation Grave. By the 3rd day of the Bulge, every American soldier in the Ardennes was suspicious of every other American soldier. Passwords were changed hourly. Officers were questioned about baseball, about state capitals, about the names of movie stars to prove they were not Germans in stolen fatigues. Patton needed men at his checkpoints. He could trust absolutely. He gave the order to the 761st. Black soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion and other black units in the 3rd Army sector were assigned to guard key checkpoints. The order that went with the assignment, according to accounts that have survived from 3rd Army headquarters, told them to shoot any white American soldier at those checkpoints who acted suspiciously. Read that sentence again. The grandson of a Confederate colonel, in the winter of 1944, gave black soldiers the authority to shoot white American soldiers. Not because he had reconsidered his views on race. He had not. Not because he had become an ally. He had not. He did it because he trusted them. He did it because at a moment when his army was hemorrhaging and every hour mattered, and the Germans were close enough to Bastogne that Skorzeny's men could reach his supply lines. Patton needed soldiers at those checkpoints who could not under any circumstance be Germans in disguise. The color of the black soldier's skin in that specific tactical moment was the one thing Otto Skorzeny could not counterfeit. Patton weaponized the thing the American army had spent 200 years using against black soldiers. He turned it in one operational order into their credential. It was not a gesture. It was not a lesson. It was a general using the materials in front of him to save his own men. But if you were a black soldier of the 761st, standing at a checkpoint in the Ardennes on December 22, 1944, with a Thompson submachine gun in your hands and the authority of the 3rd Army behind you, to shoot any white man who could not answer a question about the World Series, You understood something about the army. You served in that no memo could have delivered. Your rank was not conditional at this checkpoint. Your rifle was not conditional at this checkpoint. Your color was not a liability at this checkpoint. It was the proof. The 761st held those checkpoints. They fought through the bulge. Somewhere along the way, breaking into their radio frequencies, a woman named Mildred Gillars, an American broadcasting Nazi propaganda under the name Axis Sally, called out to them by name. She addressed the 761st. She told them in the vocabulary of Third Reich radio that they were fighting for a country that hated them. She told them their commander was white and would never be one of them. She told them to lay down their arms. They did not lay down their arms. They took Tillet. On December 26, 1944, elements of the Third Army broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. German officers captured in that sector and later interrogated by American intelligence gave a consistent answer when asked why they had been defeated. General Major Heinz Kokott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division at Bastogne, wrote in his post-war analysis that he had calculated American logistical capacity carefully. He had been wrong by 48 hours. He did not mention the color of the Americans in that column. To him, they were the enemy. The enemy had arrived faster than he thought possible. That was what mattered to Heinz Kokott. It should have been all that mattered on the American side too. But that was not the war. The 761st had come to fight. They had come to fight two wars at once. One was against the Wehrmacht. The other was against the country that sent them. And they were winning both, but no one at Third Army headquarters was writing that down yet. The Battle of the Bulge ended in the last week of January 1945. The Germans had shot everything they had left in the Ardennes. When the smoke cleared, the Wehrmacht was walking home. The 761st Tank Battalion was still moving forward. Through February, through March, into the Rhineland. The Siegfried Line was waiting for them. The Germans had built it before the war. Steel-reinforced pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, fortified villages with interlocking fields of fire. The line had been designed by German engineers with one purpose: to stop exactly the kind of armored assault the 761st was conducting. They cracked it. They spearheaded a section of Task Force Rhine and punched a hole through concrete that had been poured to be permanent. Behind them came the rest of Third Army, into Germany, into the last months of Adolf Hitler's war. By early May 1945, the 761st was moving through Austria. On May 4th, they came to a place called Gunskirchen. It was a subcamp of Mauthausen. It had been a labor camp. By that spring, it had become a place where Jews from Hungary and Czechoslovakia were sent to starve. The SS guards had left the day before, taking whatever food remained with them, leaving thousands of prisoners locked inside. The 761st was part of the American force that reached Gunskirchen. A young Jewish girl who survived the camps of Nazi Europe later wrote a poem about the men who liberated her. Her name was Sonja Schreiber-Weitz. She was 17 years old. She had survived Auschwitz. She had lost most of her family. She had never seen a black person in her life. She saw one standing in a doorway. Years later, she wrote about him. A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought, he must be the Messiah. The 761st Tank Battalion had been in continuous combat for 183 days. That is the longest sustained combat tour of any American tank battalion in the European theater. They had lost 3 officers and 31 enlisted men killed in action. They had earned 391 decorations for valor. They had destroyed or disabled more than 30 enemy tanks and 163 machine gun positions. They had supported the capture of 30 towns. German casualties attributed to their operations exceeded 130,000. They had captured or killed enemies from Nancy to Austria. They had opened the gates at Gunskirchen alongside their comrades. They had held the checkpoints at Bastogne. They had done everything the United States Army had told them black men could not do. When the after-action reports were written at 3rd Army headquarters that summer, the 761st Tank Battalion was not officially cited for meritorious service. Their name was not entered into the record of the units Patton personally commanded. The silence was not an oversight. The silence was a policy. Somewhere in Bavaria, that summer, George S. Patton Jr. was still commanding an army. The Germany he had fought across was becoming an occupation zone. Patton, characteristically, was making enemies in the process. He argued with Eisenhower. He said things to reporters he should not have said. He was relieved of the Third Army Command in October. On December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, his staff car was struck by an American Army truck. His neck was broken. He lingered for 12 days at the U.S. Army Hospital in Heidelberg. He died on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. He had lived 227 days past VE Day. He never wrote a public tribute to the 761st Tank Battalion. He never publicly named Reuben Rivers. Whatever Patton believed about the men who had held his checkpoints in the Ardennes and cracked the Siegfried Line for him and reached the gates at Gunskirchen, he took it with him into the ground at the American cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg. Which brings us to the true answer. The question the title of this story asks is, what did Patton do when a white officer refused to salute a black lieutenant? The honest answer is that no such single incident survives in the historical record with the drama the story is usually told with. There is no confirmed anecdote of a four-star general dressing down a rear echelon lieutenant on a muddy road near Nancy. What survives is more difficult. What survives is a pattern. White officers routinely failed to salute black officers throughout the segregated American army of the Second World War. The pattern was documented. The pattern was structural. And the response of the American military system from company clerks to generals to the War Department was to look the other way. Patton did not fix that. No one did. What Patton did and what the record confirms he did was different. He gave the 761st Tank Battalion the speech in Nancy that told them their color would not matter in his army. He gave them the assignment they had been denied by every previous commander. He gave them the checkpoints in the Bulge. He gave them the tip of the spear at the Siegfried Line. He gave them the mission at Bastogne. And he gave them his silence when the medals were handed out. Every one of those things is who Patton was. He was the general who used them. He was also the general who did not thank them. That is the answer. It is not the answer the internet wants. But it is the true one. Reuben Rivers is buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery in Saint-Avold, France. Plot C. Row 5. Grave 53. The Silver Star recommendation his captain submitted on November 20th, 1944 was upgraded to a posthumous Silver Star and a Purple Heart. The Medal of Honor recommendation. The one Captain David J. Williams had put on paper the day after Rivers was killed sat in army files for the rest of the war and for a generation after it. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion. It was the recognition the unit had earned in the fall of 1944. It arrived 33 years late. In 1993, at the direction of the United States Congress, the Department of the Army commissioned researchers at Shaw University to study why not a single African American soldier had received the Medal of Honor for service in the Second World War. The study concluded what everyone had known. The reason was race. The researchers identified 10 African American soldiers whose actions in the war had merited the Medal of Honor and who had been denied it. Congress moved to correct the record. 7 of the 10 cases moved forward to final approval. One of the 7 was Reuben Rivers. On January 13, 1997, in the East Room of the White House, President Bill Clinton stood at a lectern in front of 7 American families and 1 living recipient. He read the names. When he read Reuben Rivers, a woman stepped forward. Her name was Grace Woodfolk. She was his sister. She accepted the Medal of Honor of the United States of America on behalf of a brother who had been dead for 53 years. A brother who had pushed away a morphine needle in a muddy field outside Gebling and told his captain, "This is one order, the only order I'll ever disobey." He had disobeyed it in November 1944. His country had taken until January 1997 to obey him back. If you go to Saint-Avold today, you can find Reuben Rivers. You can walk the rows. You can find Plot C. You can count to row 5. You can find grave 53. The stone is white. The name is cut in stone the way the army cuts every name. The rank is Staff Sergeant. The unit is the 761st Tank Battalion. The date of death is November 19th, 1944. There is no mention of a Medal of Honor on the stone. The stone was cut before the medal arrived. The army has not gone back to add it. Perhaps it does not need to. Because when you stand in front of that stone, on a cold morning in November, when the Lorraine wind is coming out of the east, across the ground, he died to take you understand something that no engraving could improve. The answer to what Patton did. The answer to what the army did. The answer to what America finally did 53 years later, with a democratic president reading a name off a card in the White House. The answer is not in a single moment. It is not in a slap, it is not in a general dressing down a lieutenant. The answer is in this grave, and in the grave beside it, and in the graves of the 33 other men of the 761st who never came home, and in the poem of a 17-year-old girl who saw a black soldier standing in a doorway and thought she was looking at the Messiah. The answer is that these men fought a country that would not salute them until the country ran out of excuses. The answer is that they won. It only took 53 years for the paperwork to catch up.